to Backyard Composting 101. I wanted to just try and cover some of the most basic aspects of composting because I feel like it's such a simple concept, but there's so many different ways to do it, and people are like, oh, this is the right way, or, you know, oh, that's not the way to do it. But what I really wanted to get across to people is that there's a million ways to do it, and it does not have to look the same as your neighbor. And talk a little bit about the basics of carbon to nitrogen ratios, because that can be kind of confusing for people. So we'll also do a bit of a rundown on some of the most basic like umbrella methods that people can use, and you can hopefully take away from this what kind of composting method might work best for your setting. I just wanted to kind of take a moment to consider composting as just in general as such an asset to our community, because we're kind of in this, we're definitely in this huge issue with recycling in the valley right now, where plastic's been pretty much put on hold and we've only got like some basic options. Our the local glass recycling company just went out of business. They just sold everything, and that was such a great resource for us as like a valley with so little options. So composting is probably the most efficient kind of recycling that we can do in this valley, because we're so separated from, like if we want to recycle glass or any other kind of material, we have to truck it to Spokane or wherever. And this form of recycling, you can take it into your own hands, you can do it at your house, and that's as local as it gets. So, and it also provides us with a resource that's incredibly valuable to the local soils here. It's not just like, it's important to crush glass or recycle whatever material. And we get something that's useful out of it. But with composting, you get something that's like not just useful, it's invaluable. And it's something that you can use in your garden, you can give it to your friend. It's something that everybody can use somewhere. So who am I and why am I talking to you about this? I started Dirt Rich Compost in July 4 years ago now. So we are, I guess you'd consider us like a large-scale composting operation. We're not municipality size, but we're medium. We are contracted out by all of Glacier National Park, different restaurants all around the valley, and by residents too. So people who are, you know, producing up to, Glacier National Park is sometimes a 1,500 gallon day that we are composting that much food waste in one day. So it's a lot of waste. We are located in Columbia Falls. Yeah, I've been doing this for 4 years. I'm an ag background, but I ended up being more interested in the soil cycles and recycling in general, and making sure that we take care of our soil or we're not gonna grow good food. I'm sure there's like a vast variation of people's understanding of compost and how much experience they have with it. Who has done their own compost before in the backyard? Who is like aspiring to do that and is wanting to do it this year? Okay, so it's like a good mix of people who have maybe some basic understanding and some folks that maybe could use a little brush up too. So I'm sure anybody who's looked online or in a book about composting is saying, oh, you gotta get the carbon to nitrogen ratios right. So what is the material that have more nitrogen and more carbon? And this might be like an overview for people, so sorry if it is already, but I think of anything that's nitrogenous is having color. So you can see there's some salmon up there. Anything that's kind of still alive and it has color is nitrogenous. There's some grass there, there's some poop, there's some garden cutback, some kale from the garden that's not fully like dead yet. So that is nitrogen. That's gonna be the part of your pile that's causing the heat if you decide to do a method that's gonna be involving. And carbon is anything that's dead and gone, it's brown. So that's gonna add kind of the biggest bulk to your compost, and it is an important factor that people either don't have enough of, and if they don't have enough of it, too much nitrogen, that pile is gonna smell, or it's not gonna do anything. It's just gonna become putrid, it's gonna become an animal attractant. And if you have too much carbon, it's not gonna do much. So it's not gonna be heating up, right? So you can see there's like wood chips, brown paper bags, leaves, like, these are all things that we all have, and we probably, most of it end up getting thrown away. Or some of it end up getting thrown away, where we could be utilizing it as our carbon source. So the different composting methods we're going to talk about are thermal composting. That's the composting method that involves heat. Static or cold composting, and Burma composting with worms. All right, so I kind of made a little rubric of things to consider, characteristics of static composting, thermal composting, and Burma composting that you might want to consider when you're trying to decide which method to use for your household setting. So if we're starting with static composting, you can see some different examples up here. It's very high carbon. It's great for farms or for people that have a lot of backyard cutback, like some grass clippings, but also like a lot of leaves and pine needles that have fallen on the ground, and they end up bagging it up and putting it in the landfill, which makes zero sense because it's a great resource to turn back into a soil amendment. So it's kind of known as the compost happens method. So oftentimes you pile it up and you let it sit. So the materials that you need for a static composting pile is anything, mostly carbon materials, straw, wood chips, food waste in small quantities, which is considered the nitrogen portion. So it's got to be in pretty small quantities. That's not the main thing that you want to be composting if you're doing the static method. You can compost food waste with it, but because food waste is the nitrogen source, it's going to be heating that pile up, and you want to keep it cool. You don't want to have to deal with it. So brown bags, egg cartons, you're going to need some water. Limbs, yeah. So yeah, you can layer limbs in there. Those are going to take the longest to break down, but lots of people need to process limbs and they don't know what to do with them. That's a great way to do it. So materials, yeah. Carbon and nitrogen ratio, so you'd probably in that setting not want to have more than 10% nitrogen. And let me just take a second, I'm veering back. So you can look up online like, ooh, wood chips have whatever percent carbon to nitrogen ratio, and leaves have this, and food waste has this, and it's like, you can get a basic understanding of the ratios or the percentages online. You can figure it out, but I really suggest, because it varies, and that's not the best resource to know specifically for what you have, depending on how old it is, how dry it is, all these different things. Like, you can't really say how much carbon percent is in a wood chip unless you know that exact wood chip and how much water, blah, blah, blah. So just experiment, get a basic understanding, idea from that idea of brown to greens, and experiment on your own. Don't feel like you have to get it perfect. Mess it up as much as you want. It's okay to mess it up and try again. But so carbon and nitrogen ratios with the static cold composting, 10% nitrogen or less. Pathogens. So another thing that we need to consider when we're composting is are you putting human or animal feces in it? Are you putting food waste in it? Is there something that might, if you put that compost on your garden later, get you sick? This method is not a great method to break down human pathogens, because generally you need heat. The cold composting method is not going to give you that. So if you're wanting to compost feces, not the best method, right? The amount of material that you would use for static composting, it can be as little of a pile as you want, or it can be huge. That's why it's great for farms, because they can just pile a ton of stuff up and leave it. And it can be as big as they want. So the next thing to consider with static is the space. So how much space will you need for it? Also depending on the size. Generally, somebody that's doing static cold composting, I'd be like, you need a pretty big backyard, probably. At least some backyard area. But the great thing about static composting, especially in this area, because wildlife is such a huge issue when we're composting, that you don't have to worry about it being an animal attractant. Your backyard does not need to be fenced. So, because there's no food to attract the animals. So that's something to consider in your situation. Weeds. Do you have a ton of like invasive weeds that you want to get rid of? Or, you know, weeds from your garden that you just pulled? Do not throw it in this pile because of the same heat issue. It's gonna be spreading those weed seeds in places that you don't want to.
Because it doesn't get hot enough.
Because it does not get hot enough to kill them. So this is not a good method if you want to compost weeds. Personal input. So that's another thing to consider. I tell people, like, how much time do you want to put into your compost? Because you could spend every day with that compost pile, and some people do, and that's just because they're compost nerds and they like it, like myself. But some people don't want to do that. They're busy. They have other jobs. They have kids. So you need to consider that too when you're trying to decide what kind of composting to look into and do. This is the least input on your behalf. Like, you pretty much just throw it there and let it process, right? Yeah.
Does a big static pile compost faster than a small static pile, or is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh wait, faster? No. No, if
so
you have a big old pile.
Size doesn't matter on the.
Say that again?
Size doesn't matter on the rate of composting.
Size does matter, yes. So if you've got a huge pile, there's gonna be some finished stuff underneath, but it's gonna take a lot of time to break that down. That's the next thing that I'm getting to is time till it's finished. So what are you gonna do with that compost? Do you wanna have it consistently throughout the year? Or is it like, I just wanna do something with this material and recycle it? Like, is the actual product a concern for you or not? Because if you're piling something up like that in the static method, you're not putting as much energy into it, but it's gonna take a lot more time to give you what you want. So that pile up there is gonna be like, at least like about 2 years probably. So you just let it sit. The product rendered from static composting is fantastic product. So I'm sure if any of you guys have gone to any other classes talking about soil biology at Free the Seeds, you may have heard about, you know, fungi and bacteria and microbes in the soil and how important they are. In garden soils that have been tilled or just farmed at all, generally it's really, really high in bacteria and really, really low in fungi, and that's a problem. That causes weeds. That causes low nutrient density in your plant. So this compost is like gold because generally it's totally fungi dominant. So you're adding fungi back into your garden soil, which is really important.
And is this a better method than the other ones for getting that, or?
You know, I'm gonna go ahead and say that you can't, a lot of people say, no, it's not. If you know what you're doing and you're doing thermal composting well or Burma composting well, then you can get a great fungal content out of those methods. I'm gonna go ahead and say that this is the easiest way that you can mess up to get a good dominant, like fungi dominant material. You don't, because fungi don't like to be messed with. They don't like a lot of activity, and what you're doing is you're letting that sit. You're not touching it, and oftentimes it's even great to put like a tarp over it or something like that. Make sure you're keeping it moist, but that's where fungi love to grow, and you don't have to do anything about it. Nature takes its course. So yeah. Did you have any?
Oh, well, I don't know if this is related or not, but I've been reading up on something called hugelkultur beds, where you kind of bury sticks and woods, and it sounds kind of like this static method that you do, but then you top it with some compost and soil, and then just kind of let that compost over time. So you're kind of planting on top of your compost pile.
Yeah, I think, I don't know a ton about hugelkultur. I've used it a little bit, but I'm sure that there's a fungal, like, it encourages some fungal growth, I imagine, but I've also just read that it's also, the benefits are that it keeps water retention is the main priority with hugelkultur, but I am by no means like hugelkultur person. But yeah, I'm sure that would be a thing. Yeah.
you mentioned obviously not putting weeds or anything noxious in these piles.
Right.
If you have a weed issue, what are we supposed to do with that? Burn it? I mean, where do you put it in a pile in a corner in the middle of your, the side of your yard that you're not growing things? What do you do with it?
So I'll talk about that in a little bit. Thermal composting is a great method in that scenario because it is heating up. What we use at our site is thermal composting, and our piles are getting up to about 160 degrees for weeks at a time sometimes. So that's definitely killing human pathogens. That's definitely killing weeds.
Do you have to stack it in a certain order?
Generally, I'd say the best practice for any kind of composting is just a basic layering method. Like, try to like put a little bit of intention. Like, it doesn't, with all of this stuff, like just try it. But generally, like, layering is a good way to go, especially if you're adding, in this situation, if you are adding nitrogen, like with grass clippings or food waste, you want to make sure that you're not just throwing the nitrogen into one clumped area, because that will end up possibly putrefying if it's too much. But yeah, just like distribute it and layer it a little bit. It's a really great method for people who have a lot of garden cutback, a lot of branches and trees and grass clippings and just stuff from a big backyard that they're like, what do I do with this? I don't want to pay a bunch of money to go throw it in the landfill where it's not even being used. So pile it all together, leave it for 2 years, and you will have gold. So the materials that you're going to want for thermal, all of the same materials as you would for static, but this is where people talk about it being important to make sure that you get the right nitrogen to carbon ratios. And how I spoke about, if you have too much nitrogen, it's just going to smell like crap, and it's not going to do much besides attract flies. If you have too much carbon, it's not going to do anything, and it's going to act like a static pile. It's going to take 2 years to break down. So carbon and nitrogen ratio, you're going to want about 30%, some people might call this high, about 30% nitrogenous material, so food waste or grass clippings or cover crop that you just cut, whatever. And the rest carbon material.
I have a quick question about that. Is that
Yep.
30% like by volume or by weight? Or how do you
I just look at it, that's a great question. I will be honest, like when I do any of this stuff, I'm like more, I will use my hands and just like a basic intuition when I look at things. And that's the whole idea behind like trying it. Is this like in troubleshooting? Like what issues are coming up? Oh, I must have too much carbon right now. Because you could get really scientific about it, but I would say it's unnecessary. So just try it. Just try and add what you look, if you're eyeballing something, be like, okay, well this material looks like about 30% of this. Sorry, I can't be more specific. And if you have come up with a system that's much more like articulate, like and detailed, let me know. Yeah, so human pathogens, if you're wanting to, and people all over the world do this, it freaks people out, but if you want to compost poop, this is a great method for that, like whether it's dog poop, human poop, whatever, that carries pathogens, human pathogens or food waste. We used to pick up from Kalispell Regional Medical Center. Who knows, right? So we want to make sure that that's getting really hot and that we're turning it a certain amount of times and we're regulating it to make sure that there's no human pathogen issues. And we do tests afterwards too. And that's an option to keep in mind as well. If you're not sure after your compost is finished, you could get it tested. Yeah, so this is a great method if you want to compost food waste or so the amount of materials that you will need. You can process as much material as you have space for, pretty much. So this is going to have to be outside in general. I'm sure people have experimented with doing it inside. Go for it. I am not going to put that in my house personally. I'm probably going to try and do it outside. So the space that you can use, you need backyard space. And in this kind of scenario, if you're composting a lot of food waste, we live in Montana, and I've had some interactions with the bear specialists here because we compost on such a large level that they kind of need to make sure the tagged bears that they have aren't just veering off towards our site because, you know, that's a huge issue. And we've talked with the bear specialists in the valley, and they're like, that's one of the biggest issues that we have with the interface between humans and bears and whatever kind of wildlife is they're not composting correctly, and it's becoming an attractant to these bears and to the raccoons and to whatever else. But if you do it correctly, it's not going to be an issue. But so often we're humans and we forget about it, and we, whatever, you know, we're not perfect at it yet. So it does become an attractant. So that's something to consider if you're going to be composting food waste outside. You need to make sure you're either like super confident about it, or it's fenced in, or you're in an urban setting where you're not afraid that there's going to be bears and raccoons and whatever else getting into it. Yeah. Weeds. So this is what you were talking about with the invasive weeds or non-natives and weeds from your garden. This is a great method to just add in. And actually a lot of times those weeds have some really great micronutrients and a lot of great things that could be utilized in compost. It's just they're considered weeds here. But actually they're serving a purpose, and they're actually like mining down really deep in the soil and bringing some things up that could be really useful for your compost. And it's getting hot enough that the seeds shouldn't be an issue. If you're getting it up to 130 to 160 degrees for a certain amount of time. And that leads me to talk about the personal energy input. So this is going to be the most energy intensive one. Yeah, it's going to be the most energy intensive one, and you're going to need to be regulating it to make sure you're doing it correctly. You're going to need to be monitoring the temperature, turning it. So if you're excited and really want to get into composting and really want to make sure that you're composting food and doing all of that stuff, and you feel totally fine with dedicating half an hour every day to it or more, depending on if you're turning it that day or not, this is a great method for you. Time till it's done. This is also something to consider for the people in here that are more interested in the product that you're getting afterwards and having it more consistently throughout the summer or the fall or the spring, whatever. You can get compost, if you're doing thermal composting method properly, you can get compost in like 6 weeks. So that's something to consider too. You can get more of it, especially if you've got batches going. The product rendered, thermal compost is awesome. It's got different microbes and different little biota, some that are the same and some that are different from the static composting that are a great addition to any garden soil. So, equipment. So this is going to be a little bit more like of an investment because you got to get a thermometer. I'm sure most people that are gardening have like a pitchfork or a spade shovel hauling equipment, and you want to make sure that you feel like, you know, strong enough and able enough to be turning, like, depending on how big your pile is, like 5 times, you know, transferring it.
I was going to ask you, like, what do you consider turning?
Okay, so,
Move the whole pile from one spot to another spot?
right, so if you look at that top picture right there where it's got the boards and everything, like, in my opinion, that's probably the simplest way to go if you're going to do thermal composting is you have like 3 sections of things going on, or more. And say you get to the top of that pile, you're finished layering, and it's time to start the whole process of turning. You pretty much, you start from the top and you relayer it over and over, and then you just keep transferring it over, and you just try and mix it up and add water in as you go. So I'll try and like answer these kinds of questions, and I wish I could answer more of them, but primarily I'm just trying to help you decide, because there's so many different kinds, which ones to start looking into for yourself. But generally in that kind of a scenario, you just want to unpack it, relayer it,
But are you keeping it in the same box, or are you moving it?
Moving it.
To a different box?
Yes, so like if I was doing it, it would be like my pile's here and it would end up over here. Yeah.
And that's every day?
So generally with thermal composting, once everything's mixed up and you've got your water going into the pile, it's for the first like week you're going to be turning. Like at the beginning, you're going to be turning more, and as it ages along, you're going to have to turn it less. So ideally, you don't want to have to turn it more than like 5 times, because that's a lot of energy, and that means you probably have too much nitrogen in there. It depends on the space that you have and like how willing you are to get into it. Like in our scenario, because I have a facility, we just take it to our pit. But if I didn't, I would probably be bagging up my food waste, this is me, leaving it outside the door and letting it freeze. That's what we do at Dirt Rich, because we don't have large enough equipment yet to be processing at a mass, like a much more mass scale. We've got tractors, we've got turners, but our piles aren't big enough to retain the heat. So we just freeze the food. We pile it up, freeze it, and in the springtime, in 3 weeks, we will be like crazy processing all of it, yeah.
Is there any issue with it rotting, like rotting without any ground material before, or does that not matter? It can be
If
some,
it's
it can be a
frozen?
no, if you don't take it outside.
For a week. If you're building up in the house for a week.
And then taking it out.
Oh, no.
And it starts to turn gross, like there's no, and it's molded and it's fine.
Yeah.
It's good. Okay.
Yeah.
Just making sure.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Yeah, totally. It's just doing its thing. It's starting to break down a little bit. Yeah, no, it's not a problem. Yeah.
I have heard of people storing it in their freezer too. Like,
Yeah, people do
like
that.
a deep freezer, they just fill it up all winter as the meat goes out, the
Mhm.
veggies go in.
Right, right. That's actually not a bad
And
method.
you don't have to worry about it heating up outside like on a warmish day.
Totally, and maybe the neighbor's dog
Yeah.
wandering by or something like that. Or my dog. Yes. So actually, that's another thing that I forgot to talk about with the static piles and why I don't do static piles at my house, because I have a doggy. And he loves that pile. He wants to go take a crap in it. And then I'm like, shoot, because who knows what I would be spreading in my garden. So consider that if you've got cats and dogs, that if they have access to it, they're going to utilize it. So, and then this is another part to your question too, about what to do in the winter. Burma composting, I'm a big fan of it. I think it's a great option for people that have limited space, and you can do it inside. Yeah. So Burma composting. The materials that you're going to need. So all the same kind of nitrogen and carbon materials, but much more carbon than nitrogen as well. So more like 20% nitrogen and 80% carbon. A worm, I think it's, 2 pounds of worms, specific worms that you want to get. You want to get red wigglers. You don't want native worms because they're just going to flee. Red wigglers are from Europe, and for some reason, the worms that they will stay put, and that's why people use them for vermicomposting. 2 pounds of worms will eat a pound of food waste in 24 hours. So half their body weight in 24 hours. Like they're magic little guys. They're pretty awesome. And what one of my teachers likes to say, what comes out of a worm's butt is magic. So it's really great product. Yeah. So just making sure that you're not feeding them too much food waste, but it's pretty easy to tell if you are, because they're fleeing, it smells a little weird, and in that case, all you gotta do is add a little more carbon. They like carbon, give them some egg cartons and some newspaper and they'll be happy. So the space that you need for vermicomposting, it's good for indoor composting if you don't have a lot of yard space to utilize, or it's unprotected from wildlife and you want to compost food waste. It's usually contained in some kind of box. Like I made mine out of a storage container and just punched some holes in it. Like it's really easy to make the composting setup, or like there's a million ways to do it online. There's so many different tutorials of how to make a worm box or whatever. And I have a basement, so I can put it in my basement, but you'd have to get kind of creative with where you would put yours, I guess. So weeds.
Do they need to stay warmish, or like would like an insulated garage? You know what I mean? Something that's not freezing, but not as warm as a house.
Short answer, when it's in a smaller area, if you're only like composting this much, yes, you want to make sure it's above freezing. If it freezes solid, they will die. They probably will have some little eggies in there that'll hatch when it defrosts in the spring, but generally they like it to be at least like 40 or 50 degrees. They're more productive at that time, like any other. Yeah. So weed seeds issue. They're not going to be a good tactic for getting weed seeds processed because generally it's not going to be heating up. You don't want to. If our piles are heating up, that's when the native worms run. They don't want to be near the heat. They want it to be cool. So not good for processing weed seeds. Personal input time. It's just taking care of the worms, monitoring that there's enough water, not too much. So it's a basic amount, but it's nothing crazy. You can leave them and they'll be okay for a little while.
How much water do they need?
I mean, it depends on how much you have in your, like how much material you have in your system, but you don't want there to be like a little like lake on the bottom of your thing. But the carbon material that you put in there, it's even a best practice to just kind of soak that carbon material. So it's wet, but it's not like, if it starts to smell in there, you know that either there's too much water or there's too much nitrogen. I wish I could give you a better answer, but it just depends on how much you have in there. How much product. Time till it's done. So it's kind of in between static composting and thermal composting. You can have worm compost in like 3 months, maybe. You know, whereas static's like a year or more, and thermal composting can be as little as 6 weeks. So it's a great in between. And it's just like thermal composting in that you can have different batches set up. So like you can have something consistently being finished within a month.
Right, you would start a whole bin with stuff and then add your worms to it, and then you start another, like.
Yes, so this is a great one for over.
Just add to it.
Yes.
Add your kitchen scraps each night to it, or you can.
You can. Yep, and it's gonna get to the point where that's full. That box is full. And you wanna just let the worms process everything that's in there. And there's a million different systems online. Some are tiered, and then you like attract the worms down from, you know, your full bin to the one below it that's empty. And then they'll come through like the little holes and then they'll go into the, yeah, there's a lot of different methods you can use, but yeah.
Where do you get your worms? Do you get them locally? Do you order them?
We're actually getting a Burma Compost operation like set up at our site, and we ordered them online. I have people asking me all the time if we have a local source, and there's one man that's a friend of mine that farms on a small scale for his family, and he's got some worms because he does a lot of Burma composting, and I can definitely send you his way, but like he's got a small thing going on. It's generally online, unfortunately, right now. Yeah. Time to done. Product rendered. Magic. Micronutrient dense. Worm compost. It's awesome. And you need less of it than you would like generally if you're buying a thermal compost from our operation or something. It's a soil amendment, right? So you don't need as much. You just need a dusting on whatever soil surface that you're growing instead of like an inch for maintenance of compost.
When you harvest, how do you, like you were saying, like some of the systems pull the eggs down, but how do you get the compost without all the worms? Like, can
Yes.
you reuse the worms?
Yeah. Oh yeah. So they'll reproduce. That's the other great thing about worms is they're just gonna keep multiplying, and you're gonna have so much at some point that your neighbor's gonna be like, I want some, and you can give some to your neighbor, or expand your operation or whatever you want to do. But the way that you separate the worms from the material is you stop feeding them for a while, and they've processed everything that's in the box, and then you feed them in one certain area, and they will all flock to that area, and then you can pick out some worms.
So when you said that about newspaper, and what I was thinking is, what do you not want to feed them? Or is
Right.
are there
Thank you.
is the ink on the newspaper bad for them?
Right. That's another, like, that's the same idea as like a million different people are going to say a million different things and be more purist than others. And generally, I would say that newspaper is fine. Because now, aren't they like mostly plant-based inks
soy.
now?
Oh, soy
Soy
now.
inks. And see, some people might be like, I don't really want that in my compost. So it's really just up to you. But yeah, and some people, I use cardboard. Who doesn't have a bunch of cardboard? But people are like, but what about the glues? And I'm like, maybe. I don't know. So that's just, I guess, not a great answer. It's a general answer of like, you gotta decide what you're, yeah. Zero carbon nitrogen ratio, less, about 80% carbon or 20% nitrogen. Human pathogens, they're kind of cool in the way that it does not heat up very much. It shouldn't heat up in the box where they're at, but as material passes through their gut, it is processing and killing any human pathogen issues. And actually, material that's on their skin also can deal with human pathogens. So it's less of like a sure process, because who knows if the worm has touched every single particle of that material, that could be a human pathogen issue. But generally, most of the people I talk to, and from my experience, no poop. You don't want poop in there because the worms don't like poop, but food waste that could contain human pathogens should be fine in that setting. But as far as appropriate materials, this is one drawback of the Burma compost option, is that thermal composting, you can compost meat. Yes, that's right, you can compost meat, you can compost dairy, you can compost all of these things that people have said you can't. Yes, you can do that with thermal composting, if you do it correctly. But with the worms, they don't like citrus, they don't like meat, they don't like dairy, so it's gonna make them sad. And they will not want to process that material. So if you're a person that wants to process a ton of meat, or all of the things that I just mentioned, this is not gonna be a great option for you. You're gonna have to make sure that it's all plant material, really, so, and carbon. Yeah.
So Alyssa, would you say that the Burma composting would be the best for us in our area over the winter?
Yes, that's what I was gonna, thank you for reminding me to connect that to, is like, because we live somewhere so cold, that's a great option. If you have space inside and you wanna like experiment with different box options and just get your system down indoors, it's great, it's so good. Being efficient with your system and making sure that and you guys might be like super on this and already know all about this, but I feel like a lot of people don't realize the different home materials that they just throw away. That's actually a great resource. Like, where do I get my carbon? It's like, well, if you've got a backyard, there's probably leaves, maybe. are you guys cutting up wood for the fire? Like, you've got some wood chips, maybe, that are left over, some bark. Just making sure that we use what we already have. It can be cheap, it can be an easy process, and you can use things that are like right in your house. So instead of going out and buying a bunch of stuff.
If you're using newspaper and egg crates, are you having to tear that up, or you just throw it in there?
For Burma composting?
For static?
Static? You can tear them up, but nah. I mean, just put them in there, let them break down. Those will probably be some of the faster things that break down, even without tearing them up. It's gonna be like woody materials that take a lot longer, like branches, yeah. No. But in a worm compost setting, you wanna tear them up for them a little bit. Yeah, so that's pretty much the majority of what I wanted to cover, and just kind of list some other resources that I think are great resources if people haven't already heard about. Elaine Ingham and the Soil Food Web folks, I'm just a huge fan. She's my teacher. And the Complete Compost Gardening Guide, teaming with nutrients, teaming with fungi, teaming with microbes. Those are great starting points for understanding the biological processes in the soil and your compost and why it all matters. I wish I could cover it all today, but I can't. And Nicole Masters at Integrity Soils is a great teacher too. She's out of New Zealand. And check out our website at dirtrichcompost.com. Follow us on Instagram. Sometimes we'll like drop little tidbits about different kinds of composting methods. Any other questions?
On your thermal, where would you locate that? Would it need to be full sun, or would it be in a shaded area? Does it matter?
For any of these composting methods, generally you don't want it to be in full sun. Okay. And mainly because it's going to be drying those piles out, and it's really important that you keep a certain amount of moisture in there. Generally, like the ideal amount of moisture is if you grab that material and you squeeze it really, really hard, you want 1 drop of water to fall out. Yeah.
What was the temperature for the thermal? You wanted at 160, did you say?
Yeah, and I mean, it depends on how big your pile is, because our piles are about yay high and, you know, they're actually windrows. So if it's a bigger pile, it's gonna be easier for it to hold on to heat. If it's a smaller pile, like, you know, this size, you're gonna want it to get to about 130 is the rule of thumb. 130 for like 3 days. Yeah.
How long should it take to get to 130 if you're doing it right?
Right, if you're doing it right, it should get there within 2 or 3 days. Yeah, at the most, yeah.
When people talk about composting tea, well, is that from thermal? Like, is that, what is that?
Right, that's a great question. And it's a really, really great material to be using if you know how to do it correctly. Aerated compost tea is, you're taking a really high quality compost material. It doesn't have to be thermal compost, actually any of them. You can use any of them and you'll get something good out of it if you're doing it correctly, because if you process it for too long, it could create pathogens. And my teacher, Nicole, prefers that people do non-aerated, do non-aerated, and like, say you have your compost and you dip it in like a bucket of water for, I don't know, a day or something. That's kind of the method that she might use versus compost teas, because compost teas, if they're made well, are amazing. But the problem that my teachers have found is that people do it incorrectly too often, and it either hurts their garden or it just doesn't do much for them. But I've got like a little 5-gallon, you can get them online, like a 5-gallon bucket that's for aerated compost teas. Generally, if you put like a little, you know, satchel of compost in there, what it has on the bottom of the bucket is like a motor that creates bubbles, and it makes sure that that material stays aerated, because it becomes a problem if the material becomes anaerobic and it can create things that you don't want in your garden.
So then what do people do wrong? Do they just leave it there?
They leave it for too long. They have, it's not becoming aerated enough. Things start to go anaerobic, and I actually use a microscope pretty frequently at my operation, and you can see it starts to grow things that are actually pathogens that you actually don't want to ingest. So compost tea is like a whole other class, like 6 classes, 7 classes. But I think it's really great that you asked that question, because people need to be thinking about compost teas, because it's a great way to spread the greatness and like all the juice and nutrients of compost over large areas of ranch land. Or if you don't have a ton of compost, you're like bummed, like, oh, I only have this much compost that came from my pile. Great, we'll spread it with compost tea. Make some compost tea and spread it over everything, even though you have a little bit. Yeah, so it goes a longer ways. Yeah.
I'm kind of new to Montana. Is pit composting useful here? Back where we were, it was really wet and never really froze that much, so.
Yeah.
Not really.
I have never utilized pit composting. I know people that do, and I know that there are a lot of, not a ton, but some ranching operations that utilize it too for large cattle that die and they need to process that. They'll dig like a huge trench and cover it up with a little dirt and hope that it kind of composts over time. And people that have the yard space, or I know some people that just bury their food in their garden. I don't think that's a terrible method, especially if you do it in the fall, but the problem is that it's going to tie up a lot of the microbes, bacteria, fungi that are going to go to work processing that material that's in there, that raw material, instead of focusing on your garden plants and trying to get them the nutrients they need. So they're kind of distracted for a while, if that makes sense.
I guess what we had, we had essentially just a big, heavy wooden lid on like a 4x4 pit.
Totally,
Because
cool.
we had so much nitrogen stuff, it stank like heck. But if you put it away from the house, it was
Yeah.
delicious, but
Yeah. Did you notice if it broke down over time, and if it did, what it turned into?
sludge.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's
Nice dark
leachate.
sludge.
It's leachate. It's actually pretty toxic. Yes.
But
You don't want to put that on your garden. But, you know, I'm not saying that. No offense, you know.
No, that's okay. I don't know.
Yeah. I have myself put a ton of food waste in a 5-gallon bucket and forgot about it for a really long time and come back to it and something similar, so.
It breaks down real quick.
Yeah, it does. Fly attractant. Yeah. Yeah.
Would you consider spent grain
We just
from
tell
brewing to
them into
be
the garden.
like carbon or nitrogen?
Actually, it's really high nitrogen. Yeah, so that's actually a good point.
Checking it
Something
out
that looks
here.
kind of brown, that's in
Springtime.
fact nitrogenous.
Springtime.
Thank you for bringing that up, actually.
Shucking in the garden utility.
Yeah.